Maplestory the Novel, Season 1, Sacred Tears. Written by Tatsumari Korisuno. Chapter 10, Part 1. Encroaching. Ephenia and Pharamond were less than thrilled with Dane's choice to let Orchid and Lotus into the cottage. Ephenia alone argued with him for almost an hour.
I thought you said you wanted to find a way to extract the darkness from the world, not invite it in.
Orchid and Lotus are not creatures made from darkness. They were once forest spirits that were changed by the darkness. You cannot fault them for something out of their control.
Dane calmly replied.
They are affected by darkness nonetheless. You said it takes all you have magically just to keep the small vials of darkness from affecting you. Don't you see how dangerous bringing them in could be?
She pressed. Pharamond nodded and added his own worries.
Ephenia is right, Master. Beings like this could affect you in any number of ways. They could affect the darkness you have extracted, or worse yet, become infected by it and become the very creatures we fight.
Dane sighed, putting his palms together and resting his chin on his thumbs.
I believe I can extract the darkness from these beings, and in doing so, have a better understanding of the darkness. It is so complex that 100 lifetimes would pass by from studying from afar. Orchid and Lotus have first-hand experience, and can offer a better view than I would ever discover on my own.
You're talking about creatures that could be the same as the ones attacking people!
Ephenia snapped in return.
Guaru has assured me that these two are not like them, and I have an inclination to believe him.
Dane answered.
Guaru? Who is Guaru?
Ephenia asked. She knew very well who he was, and how the old forest guardian could act petulant towards those that disturbed his peace. It made her wonder if Guaru was merely looking for a way to rid himself of these beings' antics.
Guaru is an ancient forest guardian charged with keeping many sleeping creatures safe from the darkness. It is besides the point. Orchid and Lotus have agreed to help me to understand the darkness.
Dane explained. Pharamond and Ephenia looked to the two floating balls of aura. Xenos and Mars had been called to the northern cities of Victorani and wouldn't be back until the end of the month. James was busy in the East Dragon Forest villages fending off shadow creatures, and Viren and his wife trekked through the same forest for medicinal herbs and supplies. Without the other members, any decision would be incomplete. Pharamond suggested the spirits could stay in the main hall until the rest of the members were present for a vote. Ephenia begrudgingly agreed, holding on to her thoughts and concerns for later. When the creatures learned of being able to stay, Orchid seemed to be the most enthused. Almost instantly, Orchid began pressing Dane to make them both humans, disappointed as Dane would have to quell her eagerness for time to prepare and question them. Despite showing a level of happiness, Lotus seemed more worried or agitated about the situation.
Isn't this fun, Lotus? We get to live like humans!
Orchid asked, giggling while zipping around the main hall.
That's what's scary,
Lotus replied with a melancholic tone. Orchid stopped and raised an eyebrow.
What do you mean?
What if we stop being us? What if being a human means we disappear?
Orchid thought about it for a moment, a stub of aura appearing where her mouth would be.
I hadn't thought about it like that. Dane wouldn't do that to us.
How can you be so sure?
You're thinking about it too hard, Lotus. Lighten up, it'll be fun. We get to live as a human. We get to eat things, drink things, run and play. Doesn't that sound like fun?
Yes, but...
What? Nothing. Everything will be great. Just stop thinking about it so hard.
Orchid pressed. Lotus nodded, following Orchid out the door after she tagged him and zipped off, the two of them chasing each other until late at night. Dane watched them from the window, having accidentally overheard their conversation. The last thing he wanted was to destroy any kind of trust he was building with them. Orchid seemed the fastest to trust, but Lotus was a different story. The spirit seemed more hesitant than he had in the past. For a few days, Dane spoke with him, revealing Lotus to be worried that becoming human would mean losing who they were. But between Orchid's excitement and Dane's constant reassurance that nothing of their essence would be altered, Lotus slowly warmed to the idea. A week later, Dane called the two of them into his study. He carefully constructed magical wards around each of the dozens of bottles in hopes that it would prevent the darkness from affecting these two beings. Sometimes, Lotus and Orchid would watch him over his shoulder, reading his notes. What amazed him the most was how their speech had matured, becoming less childlike with each passing day.
Yeah, what is it?
Lotus barked, a bit miffed that his play was interrupted by human things.
In this room, I stored all the darkness I have found thus far.
Dane commented, holding his hand out as both beings read a few dozen labels.
However, the more I study, the more complex versions of darkness I find. I've cataloged over 200 shades of darkness.
Orchid's laughter cut him off mid-sentence.
What is so funny, Orchid?
He asked, slightly irritated by her rude interruption.
I was right. You humans make things so much more complicated than they need to be. The darkness itself only comes from one place, right?
Orchid asked.
Yes, but how?
Lotus swept into his field of vision, cutting him off.
Making things complicated again, human. Just listen, and you might find the answers you're looking for.
Lotus demeaned. Dane looked to Lotus hard, surprised that he would speak to him in such a tone, but relaxed his posture, waiting for Orchid to continue.
You said darkness comes from the concentration of humans' unresolved negative emotions after they die, right?
Orchid reiterated.
That is correct.
Dane replied, fighting his urge to ask more questions. Orchid floated over to them, pushing Lotus out of the way. Their speech may have matured, but their actions were still very childlike.
And how do humans get these negative emotions?
Orchid pressed.
Through the wounding of the human spirit throughout one's life.
Lotus nodded as he continued.
Yeah, that pain becomes what you humans understand. Emotion. But this pain will only show a few emotions, 4 to be precise. Anger, disgust, fear, and sadness. There are many different ways these 4 emotions pop up, but these are the big ones. After that, if not taken care of, they'd evolve into the darkness we know today. If not taken care of, they'd evolve into the darkness we know today.
Dane lowered his brow, looking back to the shelves of bottles containing all the samples he had gathered.
Then, all of these shades of darkness that I've been finding?
Are the definitions of events that led to these manifestations. You need to find the root, and the tree will topple.
Lotus answered, his green eyes narrowing as though he were smiling. Dane had more questions, but there was a mutual understanding that they would provide more if progress to make them human was evident. Ephenia watched as the 3 of them became lost in a world of their own over the next few days. The new information allowed Dane to make great strides, even more so when Ephenia was near him. But there was also the coming disaster she saw in her mirror of time. Even when she forced herself to widen her gaze as the monks of the Red had told her, she could not see who or what caused the disaster. Dane seemed so close to a solution, yet the disaster would still not dissipate.
What's troubling you, Lady Ephenia? You seem down these last few weeks.
Mars asked after returning from a small request in the south.
I fear something is coming that will tear this world apart.
Ephenia replied. With all the Aurora members present, the vote was cast to allow the beings to stay, but their actions would be watched closely for any sign that darkness was affecting them.
I'm sure the Master will find the answer and rid the world of darkness. And he has you beside him, milady. Have faith in him. I certainly do,
Mars said. Ephenia smiled sadly to herself. She still had not told the others whom she really was. The facade Dane constructed was one that she began to adopt. Perhaps she had been in this form for too long, and it was starting to affect her in ways that she hadn't foreseen. If that were the case, then Ephenia may need to return to her actual body and ground herself once again as Ariel. Even she didn't know what would happen if she were to abandon herself and remain in Euphoria as a mortal.
Dane, I must return to my body for a while. I shan't be gone long,
she announced one day, coming into his study and draping her arms over his shoulders. Dane ceased writing, turning and putting his arms around her waist, pulling her to him as he rested his head against her stomach. He knew somewhere in the deepest recesses of his mind that she would return as she had before. Still, it would be different not to have her there.
It will be lonely without you here. You give me so much of my life back. I don't know how I could be without your presence,
Dane mused. Ephenia sighed, pulling his hands from around her back and sitting next to him.
More than anything, there is something that I must know. I will be back as soon as I can. In the meantime, please tell the others that I'm in deep meditation.
Dane sighed and nodded his understanding, carrying her to their bed, laying her down softly before kissing her deeply, lacing his fingers into hers. He would miss her, but he held to the hope that he would see her again soon, pulling away from her lips enough to speak.
I love you, Ephenia, my goddess in disguise.
And I, you, my mage,
she answered. Ariel called her mind back with one final kiss, taking a moment to be reacquainted with her body's movements, strength, and weight. It was almost as if the life she led with Dane was real, and this was the dream. Not wanting to waste time, Ariel enlisted the help of the Temple Knights, retraining herself to walk after being mortal for nearly 2 years. At the mirror, she peered into its polished surface. The disaster she saw was still there in the time stream. There was also the tiny glimmer of hope to turn away this disaster. It seemed even smaller now than she remembered. There was almost no chance of convincing Dane to let another rid the world of the darkness.
there has to be some way to avoid this disaster.
Ariel muttered to herself, staring into the mirror when the voice of a monk of the blue interrupted her thoughts.
There might be a way to do so, goddess, but it is a path that may bestow you with more regrets than you can afford.
Ariel jolted a bit, turning to the monk while crossing her arms over her stomach.
And what is this path, my dear monk?
She asked as the monk removed his mask and lifted an eyebrow.
Introduce another to this timeline, someone yet to be born. This person could then take up the mantle Dane has laid out for himself. I warn you again, this path may grant you more regret than you can afford,
The monk warned cryptically. Ariel sighed, reaching out and touching the mirror to introduce this new concept. Instantly, time split evenly, appearing as two roads. One led to war and disaster, and the other to peace and triumph.
That could very well work, monk. Thank you for helping me see.
I must press this, goddess. The regret that will come from this path.
If it means the survival of Euphoria, then I will bear the regret.
Ariel cut in. The monk nodded his understanding and put his mask on, returning to his portion of the temple. Ariel became excited with this new direction. Finally, a clear way of avoiding the disaster altogether lay before her. The only task remaining was formulating how this person would be born to take up this mantle. Ariel searched for when this person would be born from the present into the far future. 1 or 2 traits required of this theoretical person existed within many people born before the split of time. The problem was trying to align these people without their lives and experiences coloring the ultimate goal, the eradication of the darkness. There would be some paths that came close, but some small thing would cause it to fall apart in the end. A miscommunication, a misaligned goal, a misunderstanding, or even a loss of hope. The darkness could easily manipulate a group by simply affecting one person. But when she tested how those people would interact if brought together, the path led to the disaster she tried to avoid, even under the best conditions. The only way this could work is if a single person with all the needed traits were born. Unfortunately, Another problem began to appear. The traits alone wouldn't be enough. They also needed power. Looking over history, Ariel found that even the most magically gifted human was only half as strong as Dane. The amount of magical power they would need to channel would be even more tremendous than Dane could handle without vaporizing himself. That person would need the understanding of a mortal and the power of a deity.